it looks like we have some far off visitors. Hiroshimasu, wakarimasu. Let's see. No. Watashi wa Ceal Craig desu. It's been a while since I've spoken any Japanese. I used to travel there all the time on business. Anyway, I noticed that someone's from Japan. That was so exciting. So I'm a volunteer with Fish and Wildlife and also with the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. So I have two hats, depending on which one I wear. And for the most part, when I present today, I'm wearing my Fish and Wildlife volunteer hat. And I've been volunteering for Fish and Wildlife since 2000, so quite a while, and got involved in Drawbridge in 2008. And I started picking up the program at that point from another long-term volunteer and kind of have made it my own, and did some research, published a book with another woman, Anita, and I'll talk some more about that later. But my goal here today is to talk about Drawbridge, kind of give you a feel for the history, the people, and who lived there at the time, and talk about its future a little bit. And then we'll do a little virtual tour since we can't do the van tour that we used to do, and probably won't for another year or so because of the levee project, which I'll also talk about a little bit later. Okay, so as a starting point, in the upper left, there's the pond A17, which is a pond. There's two ponds directly north of the Environmental Education Center in El Viso, which is the southern end of the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And that one I took on September 10th, 2010, which was the last view on that levee before it was closed to the public. And we did major restoration to open that pond to Coyote Creek to tidal flow. And that opened up on 2012, October 31st. So when I did that tour in 2010, that was the last time we got to see that view, and you can't get to it anymore. And then the other picture, so these are kind of both historical shots in many ways. So the one on the left, Anita Goldwasser, my co-author of the book, had done in 1977, and she's a photographer and had been a travel writer, ghostwriter for most of her working life, and has a family and stuff. And when she and I wrote that a few years ago, we published it. I think she was 92. So she's, last I heard, she was still around. So she's in her mid-90s. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history, how we got there. I'm going to talk about some people, and then I'll got a lot of pictures along the way. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right. So I'm going to continually always orient you when we looked at these pictures. So this picture is looking to the south, and in the upper left of that picture is the A17, and right behind it A16 and El Viso. So 237 kind of is going across the very underneath those hills. You can't see it, but that's kind of where it is. So we're at the north end of Drawbridge Island, Station Island at this point, and we're looking to the south. And this picture was taken in 2007 by Dr. Chris Benton. He's a retired architecture professor from Cal. And he got, I think I first met him in the thousands, I want to say. And to, you know, the aughts or whatever you call it, 2000s. But he started doing digital kite photography. So digital photography was relatively new. And he was using a small digital camera, low resolution, of course, at that point. And he was using a kite. He had it mounted on a kite, and he would fly the kite around. And that's how they took this picture. So this is before commercial drones. And most of these photographs that are, in fact, all the photographs from him that are in here are all taken with a kite. And he gets a special use permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to take these photographs. So it's, if you look for his, look at the spelling of his first name, if you look for that, and I'm going to show you some links to his website where he, the application where he keeps a lot of his photographs. But that unusual spelling of Chris is a good way to find him. He's retired now, does this kind of stuff all over. So on the right-hand side, the west side of Drawbridge there, is what we would call North Drawbridge, those sections. And all the way at the bottom, just before you see, let's see if I could get my, let's see if I was able to find my, let's see, those little tiny marker things again, because they seem to have disappeared. Remote control, no, that's not. So I don't know what they've done with it, but they're along, I don't know if you can see my mouse traveling back and forth, but right Maddie, can you see that?
Yep, we can see your mouse.
Great, great. Okay. So that's Coyote Creek there. This is A17 and this is A16. So this section here is what is called North Drawbridge. This is the beginning going north of the Mud Slough or Coyote, Warm Springs Slough Bridge. And this is the Coyote Creek Bridge. And the viewpoint that you should be able to hopefully by next year get back out to again is out here, right about where my mouse is. That's the Drawbridge viewpoint. This section is South Drawbridge, but it's about a mile long. Okay, so that gives you kind of a quick orientation. Now I'm going to tell you some facts. Well, first the summary. So I'm going to talk about South Bay life, talk about trains and bridges, show you some maps, talk about what life was like at different seasons, and then some characters and talk about the future. Now this particular overhead was taken in 1928. You can see it's a series of stitched together aerial photographs. And, I like to think about that. In the 1920s, planes started in the early 1900s. And by the 1920s, they're really starting to be used for a lot of purposes. And one of them was these aerial photographs. And so you can see that this island here at the top of this set of photographs, it looks kind of like a duck's head, I'd have to say. But this is what had become called Station Island. And here's the railroad track, which is still there today. And Alviso was down here on the left. And the EEC, the Environmental Education Center, would have been right about in this area, right kind of where this white is strangely going across, but somewhere in this area. And then this was the Mallard or Artesian Slough. And this thing over here on the left, it was the Alviso Slough. Okay, or sort of changed. All right. Okay. So Drawbridge was less than a mile long, about 80 acres in size, so smaller than a typical farm in the Midwest. And again, here's that view to the south, which is a few years later. So you can see, and it's also taken in May. I forgot to say what season that first one was at. But this particular building on the upper left is my bellwether building. You can see it from the Drawbridge viewpoint. And whenever I go out there, I always take a photograph of it. So I have a series of photographs of that particular building and its state, going back to when I started doing this in 2008, multiple times a year there for a while. So the bridge was completed, the two bridges were completed in 1887, and they created this bridge tender's cabin because there had to be somebody that lived there. And I'll tell you why in a bit. And then in 1906, it started to really boom, 79 cabins, 2 hotels. By the mid-20s, that was really its peak in terms of population, in terms of cabins, 5 scheduled trains stopping there every day. Electricity came in after that. And then the Depression hit and some other things happened, I'll mention. And water levels started dropping. And so by 1976, it was down to 1 resident. The refuge was formed in 72. And so the last resident finally left. So that's kind of the timeline of Drawbridge, 1887 and 1976. And that's when it was occupied by non-Native Americans. I'm sure the indigenous tribes in the area used that particular island when they were doing hunting or in the summer. So this is talking about, predominantly European American people staying in it, not completely. And I'll mention that. Okay, first the early years. So most of you are from California. Look like there are a few that are in other places, but in the South Bay area, it was very much a breadbasket. There's a reason why some of the buildings and streets and city areas, communities are called Blossom Hill, and there were a lot of orchards that were put in place. So the fruit trees dotted the landscape, a lot of ranches. Milpitas comes from which is directly east of where this all is, was a rancheria, cattle, a variety of other stuff, working ranch. And so the south end of the bay was a big food producer for San Francisco, and by the mid 19th century for the miners. So Alviso, which is a small, sleepy little community, part of San Jose now, nice community, they were a working port. Lots of hides from the ranches were loaded on there. There were actually 3 sail and steam lines ran out of Alviso. If you've been there recently, like to the Alviso Cutting Marine Park, you're sitting there going, wow, how could ships get in here? They wouldn't, you know, there's no draft. Well, it's really filled in over the last century. And at that time, it was much deeper. And well into the 1920s, Alviso was a working port with passengers and freight. Around the bay, Dixon Landing, Mayhew Landing, to the north of that, I'm drawing a blank now, Cooley Landing over on the West Bay. Those were all landings that were all around. There were also hunting blinds all over the place, and in particular on Station Island before this all happened. And as I said, I'm sure the indigenous tribes hunted there as well, because they would have been after the ducks and fish around that area. So the story of Drawbridge starts with when railroads entered our landscape. And if you've done any history of the United States, you remember back when the Transcontinental Railroad, the Golden Spike, you know, that whole thing. But it started out with this group of 4 over in the West Coast area, Stanford, Hopkins, and I don't know, I always forget the other ones, but the 4 of them, they formed this railroad company and they got the contract and they built all the way out to near Utah. So there were these 2 other guys, James Fair and Alfred Davis, colloquially called Slippery Jim Fair. He was a politician. And Hog Davis, he ran a meatpacking plant in San Francisco. Anyway, they had this vision. They wanted to compete with the big 4. You can think of them entrepreneurially trying to start their own little thing. And so they wanted to do a narrow gauge railroad between originally Newark. They actually helped plat Newark, but later they changed it to Alameda for some political reasons. And then they went all the way to Santa Cruz. And in fact, they did do that and ran that for a long time. The railroad was run for a long time. They actually sold out to the big 4 about 10 years later after they got it going. But they did have this, they got it done. There are still tunnels in the Santa Cruz Mountains where it went through. The remnants of the Roaring Camp train are from this, because narrow gauge as well. So if you know of some of these landmarks in this area, they have all their history within this particular formation of this group. So the problem in our area that we're talking about, our narrow Station Island here, is there were 2 waterways. Here's Coyote Creek, here's the west, the bay. It's coming over here, and here's Station Island. And then there was this mud slough, etc. here. Mud slough, Warm Spring Slough, it had different names. And Dixon Landing was over in here. So there was a reasonable amount of boat traffic, because Milpitas is over here on the east side. This map is oriented to the north. And they needed to be able to, as this railroad track was built across here, they needed to have an ability to move the bridges so that the sail mostly, you know, could come through, right? So as a result of that, Drawbridge was formed. So they had to have a bridge tender living there because there were 2 bridges going back and forth. And because of all this traffic, somebody had to manage these bridges. Now, I'll talk about it here first. So they were never, if you could see in my video, they were never drawbridges in this class in my camera like this. You know, drawbridges typically hinge at the side and they go up. Sometimes you'll see just a single draw, but for the most part, it's a double draw. Well, these were never like that. These were always swing bridges, and the swing bridge pier, here was the waterway going through. The swing bridge was always like this. So the track would swing on a central pier. And that's what they always were. I don't know why they called them drawbridges. From what I could tell, a little history, it sounds like swing bridges might have also been a class of drawbridge long ago. We don't think of them that way today. So what was the way you could get to Santa Cruz at that time? Well, you could go by stagecoach, which would cost a good bit, take 9 hours. You could go by boat along the bay or also along the Pacific. You could take boat and carriage. I mean, all of it was fairly long. And then there was the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad, which eventually became Southern Pacific. So that's what was formed. So what they did was they built this South Pacific Coast Railroad Their goal was, and they did do it, 3 hours and 55 minutes. You left San Francisco and you got to Santa Cruz, and it cost you $3.50. First a steamboat, then you picked up the train in Alameda, and you could take the train all the way to Santa Cruz through San Jose. In 1897, they actually called it Drawbridge. They gave it a name and called it a station. They'd already, as I think about it, that's the same year that it was sold to the South Pacific. So maybe that's why they named it, but I just started to think about that when I was going through the notes again today. And then from 1906 to 1955, they had gone to standard gauge in 1906, and there were still regularly scheduled stop and go at the Drawbridge station until then. And then they just did it on a call basis after that. So residents could still call and, flag the bridge down, flag the train down and still get on train, but it was off of the regular schedule. They used to be wood bridges. Those were replaced. Then it became a truss bridge, and Coyote Creek no longer a swing. By 1955, they stopped making regular stops, as I mentioned. But today, if you go on the Coast Starlight, which I've been on a number of times back and forth, you go right through there, or the Ace commuter train, those both go through there, and a lot of freight goes through there. So the bridges at Drawbridge originally, like I said, were swing bridges, and one of them is still a swing bridge, though it doesn't swing anymore from what we can tell. So the second bridge, so the two bridge pictures on the right-hand side, the bottom two pictures, the middle and the bottom, those are the current bridges. So the middle one is the Mud Slough Bridge today, and it should pivot in the center. But when we were doing the restoration work out there, they wanted to get the, they were doing some work on 820 and 21, and they wanted to get out on the levees and do this. They couldn't because they could not get that bridge to swing. So they had to go up on the levees, et cetera. So it probably doesn't anymore. It's, I think, still managed by Cargill, but trains go across it that are South Pacific. So there's a lot of joint ownership of these things. But Coyote Creek has not been, since 1955, has not been a swing. Okay. So the first bridge tenders were, George Munderscheid's was the first one, and it was a hand crank movement. And if you think about it, late quarter century of the 19th century, industrial revolution was just starting. We were just seeing engines drive things and so on. So, and motors. So it was a hand crank movement for a long time. They didn't get to a motor installation until 1910. And you can picture how much work that was. It must have been pretty interesting. And then by the time World War I came along, they actually put 3 bridge tenders in there. I think Holden was the night crew guy. So there were words of concerns of sabotage during World War I. So they put on these 3 7x24 bridge tenders. They all lived out there. But by then it was an engine crank movement. So it stayed within the, I guess it sounds like the ownership of the railroad until Leslie Salt in 1936 bought it, and then Cargill Salt, because surrounding all of this was all these salt ponds have been built. And I'll mention their history a little bit later. This is looking to the north but it's at the north end of the island and next to what's called the recreation. I'll show you that in a bit. Okay, this is just a blow up of that first shot where I had all of the sloughs and everything, but this gives you a feel for the number of buildings. Look at all these structures in 1928. Now remember perspective, this is less than a mile long. It's right about a mile from here to here, 7/8 of a mile. And most of the dwelling structures we see are in the northern half. This little section right here is the hotel, Sprung Hotel, and then here's South Drawbridge. Now this must have been constructed because it's very straight. There's no way nature does that. And the rest of these were natural sloughs that are now forming back. And this is where down here on the right, lower right here, where I'm kind of moving my mouse, just at the bottom side of Coyote Creek is where the Drawbridge viewpoint is. So 5 trains stopped every day, as I mentioned. There are about 90 houses, and hang on just a second. And this was all before the salt ponds were built on Station Island. Ultimately, after 1928, this became a salt pond, and over here did, and we'll see some other pictures. But on weekends, especially during hunting season, which would be right about now, and last month and this month would be the peaks. There were 600 people visited to enjoy this atmosphere. Now, this is a map of what it looked like, and a volunteer, Paul Lieben, he made this with a bunch of volunteers, and in 1991, a whole crew of them went out there, and they made a drawing and a sketch of every single little building, and they inventoried it. So we have pages behind each of these with numbers, but it's just to give you a feel for what it looked like in 1991. These structures were all still there. Okay, many of them are gone, but a lot of them are still there. So here's Warm Springs Mud Slough. Here's Coyote Slough or Creek on the bottom. And you can see at this point, that edge there, those were salt ponds at that point. So now let's talk about the people there. Let me see how I'm on time. Good. Okay, so life at Drawbridge. Well, it was independent spirits. They never had a mayor, city council, anything like that. So there were no police, no services. And it was predominantly gun or hunting clubs in the north in particular, but there were people that lived there year round on the south. So the Gordon Gun Club is well known. It was built in 1876, right after the whole thing started. And you can see it better in the lower picture, but you can see this kind of arched, hypothetically like a ship's captain. So the person that built it originally was a retired ship captain, ocean-going ship captain. And so it was the shape of a ship captain, had ship bells there, still in 1979. So it was built in redwood lumber, and those that are built of redwoods are the ones that seem to have really lasted with us, as well as those that had metal roofs, which are more in the South Drawbridge. But this was taken in 2008, and last time I was out there, I felt like I could still see this, but we haven't done a physical survey, and I can't remember, it was a few years ago that Chris did the last survey. I'm trying to remember. I think it's at least 2 or 3 years now since COVID. This is where I'm not as clear since then. Okay, perfect spot to hunt and fish. That's why people went there. They looked for smelt, striped bass. There was a shrimping operation there run by a Chinese family that originally lived in the middle of Drawbridge and then moved off to the northeast, I think, edge of Station Island. And there were salt marshes around it completely. A lot of wildlife. It was a very much different life than we have today in this area anyway. And so what was winter living like? Well, that was the duck hunting time. So most of the wild stories that have come down to us about gambling, and I'm sure there was all sorts of things, they were in the winter because it was predominantly guys. They would be the ones out there doing the duck hunting, though there's clearly some women that enjoyed duck hunting and were out there. And they would go out for the weekend, go out in the train, spend the weekend duck hunting. And I'm sure there were various games of chance and drinking going on in the evening. So most of that's in the winter. And for the most part, women and children stayed home, in particular from North Drawbridge. South Drawbridge, if you lived there, you were there all the time. But the non-residents kind of arrived to hunt and party. And so these are just some pictures here of what it was like. You notice those boardwalks, you notice the water that comes in with the tide, probably with a lot of rain. So there were no streets or anything. It was just the railroad track and these boardwalks to get to the various buildings. Here's another one. I got this from the California Historical Society. I kind of like this one because it's away from everything. You can see it looking out there, and you can see the outhouse there on the right, because there were no septic tanks, no indoor plumbing of that kind. These were all, for all of the sewage, et cetera, kind of stuff, they were outhouses. And here's a couple of others, another scale of duck and hunting and fish hunting. Fishing, excuse me, not fish hunting. Now the Presida, and I've seen a couple different spellings. I've seen CEETA, I've seen CETA, but this is the one most commonly used, so it's the one I've used. And I've never found a picture where it was on the building. This is the Presida here on the lower left, as well as here on the lower right. But some of the buildings had their signs, and I haven't found a photograph that says Presida to verify exactly the spelling. Summer living was pretty different, and it was very family oriented. A lot of cabins were there. If you think about what you might do with kids when they're out of school, they would come here for the summer and spend the summer in the cabin. Stereotypically at that time, the husband then would come in and he would go on Friday night with everybody, and then he would go back Sunday night and to his house or whatever, their house or whatever, and then go to work and then come back Friday, whereas the mother would be out there with the kids throughout the summer. And so you can see what it was like here. And on the lower left, bring this one up in particular, because this building is going to feature large in some of the links I'm going to show you later. So get a good view of that. And you notice those windows, or what they appear to be, that was a screened in porch. So that screened in porch was really important. They used to have ice cream socials there in the summer for all of Drawbridge people. And there's a lot of midge flies out there in the summer. If you've ever walked out on the levees and that area, you'll just be amazed at these things. They get in your nose and your eyes. So I can't imagine eating ice cream unless I was behind a screen. So that's pretty exciting to see that. That building and the structure behind it is definitely still there. So Carrera's cabin, he was one of the bridge tenders. You see his is a little further back, and it's off this boardwalk. And this is the north end of Drawbridge. So it was seasonal. Everybody had a boat. By some interviews that were done when Paul DeLeben and the volunteers went out there and did all this analysis of structures and wrote down what was in there and what state they were in and everything. They also, it was a big project. They did a bunch of interviews. And so we have those interviews, and I've read the transcripts. We use those in the book. We tried to quote them as much as possible. So they were primary sources. But Lucille and George Severiatis, who I assume is a Portuguese name. I don't know this for sure, but that's my impression based on some of my friends who told me that. We think they're brother and sister in this context, but they might have been, maybe they met as kids and it's a married couple. I don't know for sure. But the gist of it is they were there as kids, both of them. And they remember in this time period it was such a treat to walk down to the hotel to buy candy. And they remembered it as being a great place to play. But there were others that remembered it as, oh, it's just nothing to do. So pretty typical children, right? Sometimes they're going to love it, sometimes they're not. These two pictures on the bottom left came from, in fact, I think all three came from the Dowd family. We've gotten a number of photographs from them who were there for many years. And in the top upper right, this woman in the skirt with the white lighter top, that's Ann Burns. I'm going to talk about her in a little bit. And they're on a boat with Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So just to give you a feel for what summer life was like. So life at Drawbridge, no matter what the season, it was people who liked being outdoors. They enjoyed that. South side was mostly permanent. North side was mostly seasonal. But people enjoyed that freedom, getting away from that. And they would get together. Here's one in 1904 in front of the Southern Pacific Station. And they're all, my sister-in-law, who's a history major, she's in costuming and very knowledgeable about this. And she said, yeah, this is definitely, the date is pretty accurate because it was right after this that women's skirts started to change and men's neckwear started to change and more considerably. You see this track sighting here in the lower left of this lower picture. That's where they would put a baggage car or an extra car for the weekends and the duck hunter things. And then a lot of times the duck hunters would sleep there because the hotel couldn't accommodate all this, or the gun clubs couldn't accommodate all of it. There is some things that have come down to us from the interviews and other articles are written, historical articles, that talk about there were divisions that did exist, even for a small town, pretty much like any small town, if you ever grew up or knew someone who grew up in a small town. And the Catholics lived on the south side, Protestants on the north. The more recent immigrants, Italian, Irish, Portuguese, and South, they tended to be on the south, and the English, Italian, and some other European American would be in that had come earlier were on the north side. So there were some socioeconomic differences. It seems like the north was a little higher socioeconomic than the south. But again, this is less than a mile long. There's only several hundred people here, live here or are here at any normal time, and probably less than 50 who lived on South Drawbridge all year round. So if you think about that as a small town and with any differences, it's pretty common. People distrust people are different, much like we see today. But they would get together several times a year, have dinner, as all residents because they had to help each other. If there was a fire, they all had to go help each other. If there was an illness, somebody couldn't get out of their cabin. I mean, they were there to help each other when it all came down to it, by all accounts from what we've seen in the interviews. The narrow portion of the island had very few residents. There was no boat access there, probably why. But in general, I think one could conclude that they all had pretty common goals and pretty common interests, but it was a small town. So now for some characters. John and Anne, her maiden name was Deasy Burns. They actually spent their honeymoon there, and this is their recreation building. Okay, and you see in the back, there's this little outhouse, and you can see various stages of this. But and this is the building here. Now, this is also by all accounts, let me say this, then I'll talk about the outhouse. By all accounts, she loved to hunt and fish. Don't have any photographs of her other than wearing a skirt, but she loved to hunt and fish, as did he. And so they spent a lot of time out there in North Drawbridge. If you think about it, I mentioned no septic tanks, so this is going to come up later. Let me grab something here. Hang on. But the tide comes in twice a day and goes out twice a day. And the outhouses were open underneath directly to the bay, to the marshes, to the water. So they counted on the tides washing things out twice a day. Now, if you think about that with 100 people or 50 people, somehow mentally that seems doable. But if you think of that with 600 people visiting on the weekends for duck hunting season, it must have been interesting, shall we say, interesting. Okay. There were some people that lived in South Drawbridge that lived there year round, and they were boat and decoy builders. And Billy Robinson was one of the more well-known. This is him in the upper right with his dog. And this scull boat was their South Bay invention. They would commonly go out where this prow would have a bunch of mud on it to balance it out. Let's say there were a couple of folks in back, and they would go out there and they would hunting or fishing. Then they'd throw the mud off and they'd put the ducks, the dead ducks or fish there to balance it out. So it's very shallow draft because those sloughs were very shallow as well. Here's another photograph from the Dowds. And if you think about it, this is in the 1960s. So does anybody know what this white box is? Feel free to put it in chat or unmute yourself and throw out an answer. Any idea?
It's an ice box.
An ice box, that's correct. And it is not a refrigerator, but it is an ice box, which means that it didn't have its own coolant. They would bring out blocks of ice and put it in there. So it didn't use electricity per se. It was just insulated enough with the ice that it could keep things cold. Pretty interesting stuff. I do remember that in my grandmother's long ago. This is an iron cook stove, and I recognize this. This is a smaller one. The one I was used to was a double wide in a cabin my grandma and grandfather had up in northern Minnesota, where I spent my honeymoon with that in the middle of winter. So it was very, very accustomed to using that. Yeah, I remember this kind of look and structure, tablecloth, bentwood chairs. I mean, this is pretty classic 1960s. So the Sprung Hotel was put together by Joseph and Hedwig Sprung. They're German immigrants, came in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and opened this hotel about 1905. We do have a deed of him deeding it over to Hedwig in 1914. We have a copy of that. And I'm not sure if he passed away or what happened exactly after that. And then in 1926, she deeded it to Ike Oswald, and he eventually boarded it up in the Depression, and it was never unboarded or used as a hotel after that. So it was only about 20-ish years, 25 years that it operated as a hotel. But this is what it looked like. And it was kind of in the center of the island on the west side of the tracks, and had this tall water tower. And she had a good artesian well there and would sell water to residents who didn't have their own wells. This is her in the white dress in the lower left. That's Hedwig. And I think it's the one on the far right that is the Aloni woman that we have records of, that was their housekeeper. for the hotel. She worked as a housekeeper for the hotel, one of the housekeepers. And let's see what else. Oh, during the Prohibition days, and Hedwig got known for making, as I understand it, it was a dark brew of some sort of beer brew that she would sell out there. And then she would rent out her bedroom as well during hunting season and just sleep in the tub, trying to get as much as she can. She would serve hunters. If you look in the book we have, there's a photograph of the actual layout of the bottom of the hotel. You can see where the dining room is and stuff. But it's not longer there. And it fell down somewhere in the, I think it was 1967, 68 is when it collapsed. The hotel tower went down in 2005. So 20s and 30s, the levees were built. Now, when I first started doing this, people told me that those salt ponds had been there since the CCCWPA time, right around World War II. Well, it turns out that's not true. There were few, there were in the South Bay like that, but around Drawbridge and Alviso and the EC, those ponds actually didn't get put in until the early 1950s. And as I found from, if you go to the USGS site and you put in a GPS number, or whatever you call it, code location in the USGS site, you will find aerial photographs of various years. So when we were doing research for the book, I started pulling these, and that's when I found out that the ponds that actually had salt ponds had not been built till then. The levees may have been built. Maybe it took a long process to get to that, but it doesn't appear they were production ponds till the 50s. But as the ponds were built around it, the marshes really began to drain. The other thing that started to happen was San Jose started growing leaps and bounds. And then World War II, the whole Bay Area, with the all the construction going on for the World War II ships and various other things, the industrial complex as it started building up, all these people, well, their sewage wasn't being treated. It was going directly into Coyote Creek, and in particular from San Jose and then also Newark. So that destroyed a lot of the sloughs and wildlife. It's just sewage, raw sewage going into that. You can picture it, right? You don't have to describe it. Sprung Hotel closed when the Great Depression began. And then the classic one there we have as a quote for many people is the decline really began in 1936 when they really started to experience the decline of ducks. World War II in 1950s, people still lived there, but the water table started to really go down. And if you think about the water table, there's an aquifer underneath us all. And underneath that area, the aquifer, which isn't like a big, I always was envisioning this like big cave. Well, it's not like that at all. It's a bunch of permeable rocks or sand or something or other. And inside that is all this water. Well, the water was fresh water. And then as it had been pulled out, just like we're starting to see with groundwater being pulled out because of the drought, then they were not getting any water. So they sunk it lower and their deep wells ran dry. So then what started to happen is those wells started to fill with salt water. The salt water started going down there and they would only get salt water. So the only way they could get water into Drawbridge after somewhere in the 40s and 50s was if it came in by train. And so they would bring it in. That's why you had the big water towers, among other things. There was a lot of sinkage at that point as the water table dropped. Anderson Dam was built down at Morgan Hill. That changed the Coyote Creek flow quite a bit and slowed it down, lowered it during the winter season. So things really started to change. So by the 1960s and 70s, there were fewer than 5 residents. And in 63, things started going down. And then in 1972, it became part of San Francisco Bay National Wild Refuge, which became called the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay, NWR. In the 60s, just before that, there was a lot of theft and vandalism. I've actually seen the original of this note. She brought it in, it was her aunt's when I first started doing the program. And she had been a kid, when she was a child, she used to go there. But it didn't have any effect. People would go in there, they'd set off fireworks, squatters would go in and they thought people weren't living there and people actually were, or they would come in on the weekends or something. So, it was tough. So people started to leave because it was dangerous. Another character was Nellie Dullen. and she would live there from 1900, pretty much. Well, she moved there that's right, at 1910, at age 10. And then she left in 1974. So vast majority of her life, she lived on Drawbridge. She bought a couple different homes. She worked her whole life from all accounts. Had 3 marriages, 2 sons. Very different woman if you think about the times. And we don't have any pictures of her other than slacks. She is a very independent woman, clearly a sign of her Drawbridge times. Just check the chat here. Is there a...
Yeah.
How is that person getting water at that point? Oh, by a train. It would come in by train and they would put it in a tank and, you know, you'd store water or they'd bring water in. That was the way they got water at that point after the wells went dry. So Charlie Lucci was the last resident, and he was born just 14 years after Nellie, but basically similar generations in many ways. He lived out there. He was a linesman for PG&E. He was an inspector, a variety of things, but he worked for PG&E for a long time, and he finally left in 1979. And so he ended up, I think this was, I was just reading this morning, I think this was Ike Oswald's. I think this was Ike Oswald's cabin at one point. So there was a lot of buying and selling among them. And if you go out and look at today's Alameda County, which by the way, this is in Alameda County, because the county line between Santa Clara and Alameda is right on Coyote Creek. It's right in the middle of Coyote Creek on the south side. And if you look at the Alameda County plat maps for Drawbridge, which is an interesting exercise, actually, I did a few years ago, there's still a number of lots in there that are privately owned. So as they stop paying taxes, they can't really get to them because they're not allowed out there, but they can talk, the people who own them can talk to the refuge manager and see what they can do to visit on a short, just to check things out or something. And most of them just keep them. They're very cheap for family memory and all that kind of stuff, I'm sure. But as they come available, then Fish and Wildlife tries to pick them up. Okay, so let's talk about modern times, more modern times, shall we say. So in 1976, Fred Landers and his son Russell, they went to visit, and the sketch was made by Fred, and his son Russell gave me these in 2016. But I thought it was kind of neat because this is the 1-2-story building that is known there on South Drawbridge. The other thing here on the lower right, I think, is the Presida. It has these fish scale shingles, which it was known for. South Drawbridge, this was at high tide in 1981. Look how close that water is to everything. Here's our 2-story one. And let me show you on 74, that 2-story building is right here. Okay. And so you can see in reality, it's reasonably far away. And I'll show you a couple of other overheads from satellites. This is reasonably away from there, but here this shows how high the water could get. So there were bulkheads built, according to the bridge tender's son, to confront these rushing waters of Coyote Creek at times in the winter. And this is the Warm Spring Slough Creek. South Drawbridge, here is that bellwether building, my bellwether on the right upper side. But you can see how far these buildings are really off the waterway. It's just they look very foreshortened when you're looking at them, when you're closer by. Okay. North Drawbridge, this picture is around 1906, but it has to be post 1906 because that's when they put in the standard gauge railroad tracks, which are the outer ones. The narrow gauge tracks are in the center there. And they had both sets of tracks for a while until there were enough train cars, et cetera, that it all moved to standard, that they didn't have to have them. And then they probably took them out because they're certainly not there now and haven't been for a long time. So this was North Drawbridge looking south down. This is what North Drawbridge looks now. So 2009, 2010, 2011, fall, spring, early summer, late spring. So you can see that the differences that are starting to occur, because in 2006, and I'll show you a little bit more of this somewhere else, but the levees were breached in those ponds and they started turning back into marsh again. So it's been 17 years since they've been breached. And so we've seen a lot of changes. So when I told you I took that last picture, that last time in September or something, 2010, when they started doing restoration on A16 and A17, we could no longer drive around A17 as we were. Then we started doing the tour over to the west side and discovered some new things. This is the upper left is looking east and a little bit north over to the Fremont Hills. That white building there in the background there, that is the old, what was then I think NUMMI, now is Tesla, the big auto plant at Mission and 880. So that's kind of the perspective of it. But this is the west point of Station Island. So this west point in this right-hand picture up here, see those, here's Coyote Creek coming in. This rightmost picture is we're looking to the west and a little bit south. So this point here is the same as this point over here. There's a good, I leave this picture in the upper left end. We're looking to the east there to the Fremont Hills, Milpitas, because that's a really good picture of what the Mud Slough, Warm Springs Slough Bridge looks like. It's kind of a slatey blue-gray, and there's the swing pier in the center, though we don't think it works anymore. So the future of it, this is Alviso Yacht Club, and you can see those boats are not in the water anymore. There was a lot of subsidence. So when I first started doing this in 2008, so I left this in with too much fresh water going into the bay, because we were doing this to talk to the community about slowing the flow of fresh water into the bay. Remember, if you lived here in that time period, which would be 2008 to 2012-ish, somewhere in there, San Jose had a program where you would change out your toilets. They would give you a 3-gallon toilet and change it out for a 6. There were aerators that the city of San Jose and other water districts within the county would be handing out, so you spraying less water. The whole thing was less water going into the storm drains that would eventually go out to the bay, or into the sewers and be treated and go out to the bay. So we were trying to slow the flow, limit water flowing to the bay. Then the drought came, then all sorts, and then we did all a great job on this. And now we actually need to make sure we still get some water into the bay, so the salinity doesn't get too high. So it's interesting how things have changed even since 2008. But the Salt Pond Restoration Project was started formally, I think it was 2006, but 2003 is when all the agencies started to get together. And it was California Fish and Wildlife, US Fish and Wildlife, all sorts of NGOs or not-for-profits, Coastal Conservancy. I can't remember all the ones involved. It was like 50 of them, as I remember, and cities and counties. And they put this all together into a salt pond restoration project. So they bought about 15,000, and I think it ended up being 16,000 salt pond acres. All of this, here's the Alviso section they bought, here's the Eden Landing section they bought, and here's the Ravenswood ones they bought from Cargill. Cargill had taken over from Leslie, and Cargill's a huge company, and they're a supporter of ours. They help us pay for staff that we put on our summer camp, and some restoration work we've been doing on the refuge carver. It's been a good partner. So the work had begun at this point, and the restoration I was talking about had to do with this. So I would usually get to where I would be wrapping this up, and then we'd go take a ride. But now I'm going to work towards showing you some visuals and recent overhead photographs and stuff. But what we're trying to say is Drawbridge today is sinking into the marsh. And the water tower, when I was last out there almost 3 years ago now, the tower was still there. And I think it is from one of Chris's photographs. And then this was North Drawbridge from afar. So it's sinking into the marsh. But we still have our avocets and kites looking over Drawbridge, and the buildings are gradually decaying back into the marshland habitat because the refuge was formed for wildlife. So Maddie's going to talk about mercury mining. Go for it.
Perfect. Thank you, Ceal. Awesome. So those of you who came in a little later, I'll introduce myself again. My name is Maddie. I'm an interpretive associate with the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. And I'm here today because I'm part of a Watershed Watchers program which is for a runoff pollution prevention association. And so today I get to talk to you about mercury contamination in our bay. Not super fun topic, but super relevant to this presentation actually, because as Ceal was talking about, Drawbridge was at the heart of the bay. And what a watershed is a space where all waterways meet into the same point. So any of that runoff water will meet into the same point. And in our watershed, it meets in the San Francisco Bay or the Sacramento Delta. And so keeping that in mind, just as Drawbridge was kind of neglected by San Jose Newark with all the sewage dumping going in, there's kind of a reoccurring theme throughout history of lacking in consideration for environmental implications as long as people who might be living in the bay. So our topic of discussion today will be about the gold rush in the height of the 1850s. So at this point, a lot of the easy gold was gone. So all the gold that people were panning out of streams and rivers are kind of running out. So people began mining in the hillsides. And the way that they did this was through a technique called hydraulic fracking. And so you can see an image here in the middle. There's a huge hose that's kind of blasting that water into the hillsides. And what they're looking to extract with that are these really small little flakes of gold. And that can be really hard to find and get out of the ore, like the rock that's in that sediment. And so the way that they managed to do this was by actually mixing mercury with that water that they're doing with hydraulic fracking. So the mercury will basically bind with the gold and help pull it out of the ore and also make it easier for us to find. So we're doing a good job of getting those little flakes out of the hillsides. But where this mercury came from was actually through mines. And we'll refer to this map in a minute. But let's talk about a mine that you might have heard of before. Some of you might be familiar with the Almaden Quicksilver Park. That used to be a mercury mine. Does anyone know what another name for quicksilver is? You can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. What is quicksilver? Any guesses? What's another name for quicksilver? Mercury, yes. Okay, yeah, sometimes maybe false gold, but mostly mercury. So the Quicksilver mine was for harvesting mercury, and some of that mercury did get used for the hydraulic fracking for gold. So people were able to successfully get gold out of hillsides. It wasn't necessarily a lot, but they were using mercury to do it. It might have sounded great at the time, but there's some pretty bad environmental repercussions for that. So as you can guess, mercury is poisonous. It actually is a neurotoxin. And why is that relevant to us? Well, if you look at the map on the top right side, it's very, very small, so it might be hard for you to see. But those yellow and orange areas are the gold mines, and the red are mercury. And what you'll notice is all of those are very close to creeks and streams. That's where they got their water from for that hydraulic fracking. And aside from just the dams, which also weren't great for our local waterways and the wildlife nearby, was that because all those mines were near the streams and the creeks, if you remember that watershed concept we talked about, all that sediment that would end up flowing into those creeks and rivers would eventually flow their way out to the San Francisco Bay. So it didn't just stay localized, all that mercury runoff was ending up in our bay. And it still is actually today. So we're still seeing mercury contamination. You might have actually heard of warnings either for specific like parts of the bay or other reservoirs to say, do not eat the fish because there might be mercury poisoning. That's actually what that's from, were mines that we were having going on in the late 1850s. So things that were happening a long time ago are still impacting us today. But if you want a silver lining out of all of this, this actually led to California's first environmental protection law in 1884, I believe, and actually ended up suing one of those mining companies for all of the environmental degradation and also harm for people. So anyways, the moral of that whole story about the mercury is that some of our choices have long-lasting impacts and possibly more environmental implications than we may have originally thought. So it's just a reminder that our choices today may impact us for good and for bad for a very long time. So it's just a reminder for us to be good stewards of our watersheds. And thank you so much for the time, Ceal, and I hope that you continue to enjoy the Drawbridge presentation as I am.
Thank you. Thank you. I always learn more every time some person does it.
Good.
Okay, so typically then I would put this up and say, let's go visit. And we would get in a van and we would drive out to this point right here. We're looking to the south here. So this is San Jose down below and Mount Amanum and Santa Cruz, kind of parts of the Santa Cruz Mountains there, the Madonna Range. And you can see buildings here that are off, and there would have been boardwalks over to them. And this building here, I'm going to show you some pictures. That's the Schmolholz building. And then I forgot, when Maddie was introducing herself, I was reminded that I didn't do it. I usually do it at the beginning. I usually caveat this and say, I'm not a biologist. I'm not an historian. I have become a researcher, but I spent most of my life in high tech as an engineer and retired and started volunteering out here when I retired the first time. And then I've become an educator and researcher in my latter part of my life. So there we go. Onward. Okay, so Drawbridge virtual tour. Now we're going to take a virtual tour, and I'm going to give a little bit of an intro here with seeing how much has changed. So in 1899, all these black parts of the map, this is San Francisco Bay, and you can see our little Station Island, which I blew up here, the Mud Slough, Station Island, Coyote Creek. All of that black stuff is marsh. So salt marsh, brackish marsh, but marsh. By about 100 square miles of wetland marsh. By less than 100 years later, 90% of that was gone. We still have little bits of it, and there's still a bay in here, but a lot of it became ponds. All these are ponds, managed salt ponds. All these are managed salt ponds. And this Drawbridge is here, and just to the south of it, Coyote Creek, there's a little triangle piece of marsh. That triangular piece of marsh is still there and has been there. That's kind of like old growth marsh. You think of old growth redwood, never been logged. Well, it's kind of that same thing. It never been modified. That part has stayed. And I did find a photograph recently, and I cannot find where I put it, but people would drive out on this levee and they would park here right south of the Triangle Marsh, and they would walk across the railroad, and that's how they get to South Drawbridge. So they didn't walk 3 miles back to LV. So it looks like they did have, like, they could park along there at some point. I don't know when that changed or what happened, obviously long ago. So the gist of it is this really changed. And now we're going to go look at some of the things we're doing to change some of it back. So this is part of the salt pond restoration project I mentioned, and this is the Alviso section. The reason they're called A16, A17, A12 is they're Alviso ponds. So this is the Environmental Education Center here. You can see Don Edwards. I'm sure it's a little tough to see, but it's where it says viewing access. That's where we had an area that is right next to the Environmental Education or A-frame building. And this is the A16 pond. And what we used to do was we would go out along the thing here where the black dot is, and we would follow this red all along, this red line, and then we would follow here. Then we would come back and we'd go on the black line, the west side of A16, and then come back. That was our drive until 2010. And this whole red line up here between A18 and A17 went away. And now what it is there are like it's like a roller coaster in there. They dug in, so water freely flows from what was A17 over into the slough back and forth. So this is now turning into much more of a slough environment over time. Okay, and I started when I did this, I started doing pictures from the internet, and this was at that time, Google Earth picture of what looked like in 2008. Now at this point, right here in this lower left, where I'm throwing my mouse out, if you can see it, they actually breached the ponds there. So they started to change those ponds then. And so those were breached in March of 2006. And so by the time this was taken in 2010, A20 had really started to change. It was not much of a pond left at all. The levees are there. We didn't deconstruct any levees. We're just letting nature kind of go after it. And then right after this, A17, the east side of A17 was changed, as I mentioned, and we breached, but this hadn't happened quite in 2010. By 2014, when the levee was breached, I was out there watching it along with many other people. And it was really cool. All of a sudden they breached it and the water came flowing in here. And I've seen so much change over the years. Here's our triangle marsh, kind of reddish there. And what they built was all these islands in A16. These little round and rectangular islands were built in A16. They built a fish weir to keep fish from coming from A17 into 16 and getting trapped. So they built a fish ladder that put them back out, because this was all now completely flowing back and forth in and out of Coyote Creek twice a day. Oh yeah, thank you. Okay. And now I'm going to go into, I'm going to take it out of PowerPoint because now going to take you to 6 visions of Chris's photographs. Okay. And let me escape. Come on. Come on. There you go. Okay. All right. So the first one I got is this one. So this is 2013. And this was, these are all post levee breaches of A20 and 21. And this one is also, in fact, they're all also post the breach of A17. So this was Salt Pond A17, 4-month hiatus after a year or so after the breach had been done to A17. Okay, and you can look at these. Maddie's putting the links in chat for you. Here's the fish weir that was built. So we're looking, this right photograph of the fish weir, we're looking north, and those are the Fremont Hills and other directions. But you get a feel, I'm just going to scroll down here a little slower. You get to feel what's happened. Here's Coyote Creek, and here is the breach of A17 right here. And we're looking to the north and east here to Fremont and Tesla and, well, what was probably Numi still at that point. And let's see, a little bit lower. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just trying to give you what it looked like. Here's our Drawbridge viewpoint. And this is where he stationed his kite vehicle. This is Coyote Creek Bridge. And we're looking to the north, this third one from the left photograph. Okay, so, and this is a really nice one here on the right that shows the train coming across. And there's our fish weir again. Another direction. This is the fish weir, and we're looking to the south. So this is San Jose and Mount Amanum here. And here's a really nice view of Drawbridge on the upper left. So this is Station Island with the 2 former ponds. And here is when A17, tide is out at this point. Tide is definitely out here, because when the tide is in, this is all covered. This looks like a pond. And here's that single breach. And here is the Mallard Slough, Artesian Slough over here. So we're more and more putting where water freely flows back and forth here. And as water comes in, this changes. Now, the other thing is, this is 2013. This is before the big winter of 2016, 17, I think it is. Remember where we had all the rain and there was flooding and Coyote Creek flooded downtown and all this stuff. Well, when I went out there the spring after it, which I think we've got some, this had started to change look and feel. Right here, you see a lot of dimension, three-dimensional topography. After that, it starts to flatten out a bit more, much more marshy, because there had been so much rain, through the winter. So that was kind of interesting. Anyway, it gives you a feel for that. So let me go to the next one. Now this one is 2014. So it's the year later. And in this case, he went pretty much on Drawbridge. It was his first time since 2012 after the breach. Okay.
Looks like we do have a question in the chat there, Ceal.
Okay, let me look at that. How many trains pass? Well, Coast Starlight goes through twice, one north, one south. And Ace Commuter, I think, has 4 or 5 in the morning and 4 or 5 in the evening. And Capital Corridor. So, from a passenger train standpoint, my guess would be somewhere in the 1.5 to 2 dozen. I don't know personally for sure without going to look at Amtrak's schedule, that'd be a guess. But freight trains, there's more that goes through there, though my impression is though I'm not out there all the time anymore, my impression is there isn't as much freight that goes through there as it used to be, which surprises me. Can much be seen from the train? Well, I've tried to take some photographs, but the thing is, it's a single track. Okay. So if you look at this is a single track. So what they do when you're going through there, let's say we're coming south from Fremont, as you're getting close to Fremont, you're just, I'm trying to remember where they have the spot. It's north of the refuge, I think. I want to say it's like in the Irvington area, if I remember, where we all stop. And it goes from dual track to one track. So they have to hold the trains there if there's another train coming, let's say from the south. So sometimes you have to hold there for 10 or 15 minutes while the train from the south comes through and roars by. Then you have the track to go south. So it's only one direction or the other, depending on who's going. So they have to keep track of it. Where it goes back to two tracks again is near Lafayette, near the 49er Stadium. So there's a whole number of miles there that are single track. So they're moving through there generally pretty quickly if there's other trains that have to go through. Everybody's trying to stay on schedule, right? So I've never been successful at getting good photographs, but I've seen them. You can see them from the windows as we go by. Okay. So now this building here, this second from the left, and the building at the top of that photograph, you see there's a long one and there's two shorter outbuildings attached to it. That's the Schmalholz building. That's the one where the dentist, had the screened in porch and all of that stuff. And then this one in the lower right here, or the rightmost photograph, I should say, that is the Schmalholz building. Okay, so we're looking south here. Both of these are looking south. Okay, and here's some other views of it. And you can see that, the structures are falling apart and everything. This is looking also to the south. Right here is our Drawbridge viewpoint up here in the upper kind of rightish area. Here's my Witten. Here's the tank tower that you can see from the viewpoint. So it's a good ways off the tracks. There's a number of structures here that are good ways off the track, good ways east of the track. So there must have been boardwalks there, or they just strictly came in by boat. They had that thing they built. Okay, we got a lot of, you're putting in so you'll tell me if there's a question. All right, so anyway, these are just, here's the Schmalholz overhead. So you get a feel for what it was like. See graffiti, that's fairly common. So people are going out there illegally. I've seen people when I've been out there with a backpack, it's clear that they've roughed it overnight, but you're not, it's illegal to be out there. The fines are in the 4 digits. So I wouldn't suggest it. And here's the Schmalholz building again, and a building to the right of it. Just some different views of it. And that's his whole kite situation. Okay, so this is the Mud Slough Bridge. So he's parked at the Mud Slough side of this time, the Fish and Wildlife side. Okay, so this one is 20. Oh, I always have trouble reading this. Let's see. Show more. Tell me more. This particular outing, he doesn't have the year. I meant to tell Chris about this because his font that he's picked, I can't quite pick the year out. It takes me, I have to go to a really big screen and then I can see the whole thing. But what did I have? It's the third one. So 2015. 2015 May. Okay, that's it. 2015 May. All right, so now this is from the Alviso complex. So it's a little different shot. It's from the marina is where he positioned himself. There's something called the Weep that's got a name on it on the original maps. And just little different views here, different stuff. Salt pond in various stages, but there's one near the bottom. I want to just show you. So this is a picture of Alviso to the south. Well, I guess I'm not. I'm not sure why I had that one then. I thought I did. Thought there was a picture of Drawbridge from a distance, but anyway, the next one is Station Island itself, and that's February 2016. And again, we have the Schmalholz building. Okay, somebody there, they're not supposed to be. And you can see this is A21. So we're looking to the east. So the mud slough bridge is up here on the left. You can see its little particular look. It has metal sides and it has this swing. And then down here, on the upper right-hand side is the San Jose Alviso. So Drawbridge is right across here. You can see those buildings there. Well, A21 has been breached now 10 years at this point. February 26th, 10 years, almost 10 years. And you can see it's turning back. It's not a salt pond any longer. It's definitely a slough. There's marshes, there's rushes that are coming in. So it's really starting to see a change. And that's what we hope over time will be turning it back into the marshes that it was. All right. And then this one is, it's my second page, which would be August 2017. And so more years have passed. Salt Pond A21. So you can see a lot of change there. It's just so neat to see. The one I have about this one is this one on the left. You see where that point is? That's the west point. So that's Coyote Creek coming in there and going off to the bay. And then this is Mud Slough, Warm Spring Slough coming around. And this is the, I think he calls it the borrow ditch along the levee on the inside of the pond area. I love looking at his photographs. We have a book we sell in the store that is kind of the history of salt ponds and a bunch of beautiful photographs he's taken of them at different times. Just kind of almost like abstract art in many ways when you see the ponds. Kind of fascinating. So, and then he has some wide angle stuff he does. And the last one I was going to show you is A19 and 20, which is either side of the Drawbridge railroad track. Okay. And this was March 2020. So that's the last one I know he's been out there. So just when the pandemic closed everything down, he was able to get out there and see what it was like. And this would be 8 years post breach of the A17 and 14 years post breach of the two levees of the two ponds that are directly on Station Island, part of Station Island. So this is, we're looking to the south. Okay, here's the Santa Cruz Mountains. Here's the breach, which has gotten much bigger. Here's the breach here, which is bigger. This one is in a couple places, the one on 821. You see the railroad track, you can see the buildings and so on. So it just gives, and it's, I think he went out, it appears to me to be at low tide, pretty much. This one is 823 to A19. Well, this has to be Fremont Hills. Yeah, and there's, okay. So there we go. Isn't that lovely? Okay, so on that note, go back to my slide. And let me get my little thing out of the way that I can't tell what I'm doing because it's all these Zoom buttons. Here we go. Okay, so information and photo credits. Pan Anthony is a volunteer that did it for over 16 years that I picked it up from and modified it. She used to just show pictures, and I added text and a lot of information. So there's photos from hers. I've gotten some photos from Robert Burrell and Lynn Rogers, their whole series. I actually know Burrell now. He helped provided us something for our book. And then Chris Benton, as I mentioned, he has this Flickr account. If you look for KAP and _ Chris, I think it is, you'll find a bunch of his stuff. And he got special use. He's always received special use permits from the refuge to do this work. Eric Carlson has some interesting stuff in the underbelly. I haven't checked that site lately. I assume it's still there. I don't know. Some of the photographs came from the Dowd family, the Landers, and a bunch of Google and Visual Art stuff. So I'll close with 2 slides. One of them is just to show you, this is the back, on the right side is the front and the back side of the book, and sinking underwater. And there's a lot of detail in there and other photographs and descriptions and stories. And Anita is a popular travel writer. I've become much more researcher writer. So it's a very different voices on both, and we come at it from different perspectives. People seem to really like that. So you can still get those on the website. And if you're interested in learning more, you could write Mary DeShane. She's our program administrator, staff, and or you can purchase it on our website. If you'd like to get the quarterly digital newsletters, those are free. You can just sign up by going to the newsletter sign up. That's also on our website. And if you want to donate to support the Society's mission, which is to support the complex as a whole, there are 7 refuges within the complex. And the 4 that we specifically support besides the complex as a whole are Don Edwards, Farallon Islands, Salinas River, and Ellicott Slough, that are both south of us in the Salinas and Watsonville's areas. And then San Pablo Bay, Antioch Dunes, and Marin Islands are supported by the Friends group of San Pablo Bay. So, but all of the money we have goes to programs that support either restoration or education or support volunteers. We do fund, for example, a volunteer banquet for the volunteers, trying to thank them and offer them recognition. And then my last slide is, if you need any information, feel free to write me, Ceal Craig at the Wildlife Society, or Mary, who's our staff member, and just leave you with that information. Okay, I'll look at the, thank you, Maddie, and see if there's any wild type of animals are able to live on around the Marshalls. Well, yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, there's certainly all the bird life, which I'm more familiar with than anything else. But we do have 2 endangered species that are mammals. Well, they're animals, I guess you'd call them. Anyway, there's the clapper rail, or I'm sorry, that's what it used to be called. It's called the Ridgway's rail. It was recently changed a few years ago, Ridgway's rail. And it used to be a game bird by all accounts. And so in the 1920s and 30s, the population just dramatically went down because it was hunted for game. It's a fairly large shorebird, and it's very reclusive in the area. So it is an endangered species on Don Edwards. And the salt harvest mouse is another one that's endangered that we provide habitat for. They eat predominantly pickleweed. There's also a number of butterflies. Antioch Dunes has a lot of endangered butterflies. Salinas River has, Ellicott Slough has some salamanders that are endangered. I mean, there's other endangered species on the refuge that the habits are there for. And then if you're talking about like foxes, I've seen California gray foxes, and I'm trying to think what else we've seen. I've seen, like I said, birds. I see a ton of birds. Addie, can you think of any other animals that are?
Awesome. Yeah, there's just so many. A lot of the critters that we have out there have locally adapted to the salt marshes, and also will live in specific habitats like the slough that are fresh and saltwater, so they're brackish. So there's just a lot of niches where animals have learned to live in. And a lot of people mostly come out there for birding. I'd say that's one of the most popular things people like to do. And I know Ceal's hosted some good birding programs. So depending on specifically what you're looking for, you're more than welcome to just ask us more specifically, because there's a large assortment of animals. Of course, a lot of different types of birds, insects, and there are a few mammals, as Ceal mentioned, with the foxes.
Bunch of endangered flowers, butterflies, and all sorts of things.
Awesome. And then Steve, let's see, while you're working on that, I don't think that any in-person tours are available, because Drawbridge, unfortunately, you're not allowed to go out there. Well, not unfortunately, there's a lot of vandalism.
Right. Well, let me talk to that. I realized I didn't mention that, and I usually do it when I had the map. So let me actually take it back to map here. Okay, so I think this is probably the best one. Actually, this is probably the better one. So there's a project that started late last year, early this year. Anyway, it's called the South Bay Levee Project, right? Shoreline Levee Project. That's it. Shoreline Levee Project. It's run by the Corps of Engineers. And so this levee right here on the bottom of A16 and along here, up in this stair step fashion, over down here and over to the left, the west, I'm not sure the way it goes. I don't know if it goes down here. Go back a minute. I don't know if it goes along this red line. I'm not sure of that, but around the EEC proper, the bottom of A16, A16 is going from 8 feet above sea level to 18 feet. So they're adding 10 feet to it. And they're adding 10 feet all along here, this idea. And the idea is to protect all the infrastructure along here. In particular, this brown area right here is the, I think it's there, or is it further over? It's actually right under the word access, I think. That's the regional wastewater facility that supports all of the various regional water districts in South Bay to manage our sewage. So all the sewage that goes into the storm, through your pipes, toilets, sinks, water, dishwasher, washing machines, etc., all that goes into sewage and gets treated at the regional wastewater facility, RWF, and then it goes into mud. It goes into Artesian Slough here, and then it goes out to Coyote Creek and out. So this, if we don't have this taking care of the sewage, we'll be in the same trouble that Drawbridge was 120 years ago, with all this being raw and out there. So we need to protect them as the water levels are rising. We've seen that with king tides and so on. Again, I don't remember. You can look for the shoreline levee project and see what the path is over to the west of it, but that is what it looks like then. So I hope that answers. So you can't, so the bottom line is, I'm sorry, you can't get out to the Drawbridge viewpoint because there is so much construction going on. And they're just starting to really pick up. Apparently, they're going to be a truck coming in every 2 minutes along this road that you take out to the EC from Los Estreros right here through 6 days a week. So Sunday is the only day we're going to start doing. We started doing in-person programs. We do them outside. We still haven't opened up because of COVID, but you can't even walk out there now because of all this. It's construction going on. But by 2024, we should be able to get out here somehow. I'm not sure. I haven't seen any sketches that say, how do we get over this 18-foot thing over there? Is there gates or what? But I'm sure there will be. But anyway, that's the concept. Okay. All right.
Awesome. Any other questions? You're welcome to unmute yourself as well, or you can also put it in the chat. Mostly getting thank yous. We appreciate it. We're so glad you came to it tonight. So
okay, and so when would we started? How many per year? We used to do, if we're able to with this. I mean, it's all changing. So I don't know if we'll get out there and van again, but I'm sure they do plan to have people be able to get there and walk and bike. So I would sort of think we'd be able to get there. They've got to do some maintenance and stuff. But we used to do about 5 or 6 times a year. We'd go from May till October, depends on the season. Because once it starts to rain, I'm not driving out on those levees. Forget that. Don't bike out on those levees. I've done it after it rained. Bad move. Too much mud on the tires. Okay, and let's see, was there any other questions? Just thank you. Okay, great. All right, thank you so much. And I'll just put my last slide there. So, okay.